health, wellness, fitness, longevity, anti-aging, all of my favorite subjects. Subjects that initially brought us together several years ago.
Yeah, no. First of all, let me just say thank you to all of you for coming. I know it's tough to get away on a Tuesday night. Wednesday, sorry.
Mm-hmm. We're in Los Angeles.
Where am I? So we really appreciate it. We're really excited about this. Rich, thank you. Rich and I I've had the privilege of knowing Rich for quite some time, and seeing his story sort of unfold, which is an amazing story. 2 years before you did your first ultra, you didn't even own a bike. You couldn't walk up a flight of stairs, I think, without running out of breath. It was just an amazing transformation. I read this little blurb about Rich, and I said, I have to meet this guy and understand not just what makes him tick physically, but also mentally. Like, how did you get from that place where you couldn't even go up a flight of stairs to competing in arguably the most difficult athletic competition in the world, and even winning a stage of it, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes. You're so humble. Yeah.
Well, this is about you today.
I know, but I mean, but you're one of the fittest guys in America, and
Sanjay
makes me feel very insecure, number one. But
big star right here. Sanjay was gracious enough to visit me in our home, and we had an amazing conversation that he then shared on CNN. And I just want to thank you publicly because your interest in my story really kind of created the foundation for all the things that I get to do today. And it's just beautiful and an honor, and I'm very grateful to be able to help share this new story that you want to tell here tonight.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Rich. Thank you.
So, chasing life.
Chasing life.
Yes.
Yeah.
What inspired you to go on this journey across the globe to study these cultures and what they're doing?
Well, first of all, I feel very privileged to be able to do it, to just be able to have this opportunity to travel around the world and see these things. But I think, basically, as a doctor, I'm a practicing doctor. I'm still very involved with our medical system, and I think there's so many wonderful things about our healthcare system. And at the same time, so many of the conversations we have revolve around this fact that we spend $3.5 trillion on healthcare, more than any other country in the world by far. And despite that, we are 23rd or so in the world in terms of life expectancy, 12th in the world in terms of preventable diseases, and for 3 years in a row, our life expectancy has gone down. That hasn't happened any other place in the world. So, the thing that I really started to get at was this idea that, look, there must be places around the world where they're doing things better, where they're living happier, healthier, more productive lives, where people don't think about healthcare the way that we do. It's not something that they think of as a necessary evil, but rather as something that's just a part of their lives. They just want to live a healthier and happier life. And what are those things, and what could I experience myself? What could I prove to be true, to have some veracity? What were things that lent themselves to stories that could be told and then, bring them back to viewers? Mm-hmm. That was sort of the process.
And what were the parameters that you used in order to decide where you were going to travel to?
When we first started talking about this, everyone had an idea.
Yeah.
And, it was, we had a whiteboard. There was some 35, 40 countries that we wrote up there. Some of them were places, some of them countries, some of them were more ideas. And we had to narrow it down, basically, to 6 places. And which was really hard to do, but they all had a particular reason. So, we're gonna go through these countries, but they weren't necessarily places where people were necessarily living longer. They may have, in fact, had shorter lifespans, but they were living healthier up until the day that they died. Mm-hmm. They were places where some of the most stressed places in the world. What are they doing to try and combat that stress, to buffer themselves against that? I was very interested in pain. As a neurosurgeon, that's an area that we explore a lot. And pain is, I think, one of these areas that's so interesting because it is a real, people talk about the mind-body connection, and pain is one of these areas where you can really start to investigate that. We perceive pain differently, and we perceive pain differently in part based on our culture, where we live, what we've been exposed to already. Our self-reported pain, for example, in the United States is among the highest in the world, and everyone talks about this within the story of the opioid epidemic, which is really tragic because it's now the #1 cause of unintentional death in America, a totally preventable thing. And yet you find that there's places around the world where there should be no reason for differences in pain. They have the same sort of physical exposures that we do. So why do they have such lower self-reported pain?
Right.
That's another example. So all these countries had that we went to the happiest country, went to the healthiest countries. We picked various things for different reasons.
Right. So we're going to be watching a few clips from the upcoming series and the various places that Sanjay visited. But before we do that, I kind of want to stick a pin in this idea around where we perhaps have gone awry in the United States in terms of how we think about health and health care. I mean, right now, heart disease, America's #1 killer. I believe it takes the lives of 1 out of every 3 people. Type 2 diabetes rates are through the roof. Obesity, childhood obesity, chronic lifestyle illnesses they have become the epidemics of our time. And from my perspective, kind of looking at it from 10,000 feet, it does not look like we're headed in a very good direction. So where did we veer off course? What are we not doing right? And how can we correct this path that we're on? Just a tiny little
Yeah, I was going to say, right? How much time you got?
Solve this for us, Sanjay.
We have become a very convenience-oriented culture that has commoditized a lot of different aspects of basic living. I think a lot of it has to do with our food, first and foremost, and the way that our food sort of culture evolved, starting from how we developed diet based on palate, based on taste versus the functionality of food. I think what became sort of the thing that propelled the food industry forward was cost, convenience, and then ultimately competition was based on portion size, giving people as many calories as they could. I think at the same time that was happening, there was a increasing sort of medicalization of everything else, meaning that you thought of healthcare as a necessary evil. You went to get diagnosed and treated as opposed to actually learning how to prevent and even optimize yourself. Right. Like if the goal was to say, hey, look, I'm not even talking about just preventing disease. That's great, but I'm talking about what is my best way of living? What is my best way of living? What's the best way of fueling myself? What's the best way of me being active? How am I supposed to rest exactly? Basic human questions that I think have gone largely unanswered in this country because we have treated most of these things as medical issues versus just human living issues. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. I think a lot of the debate ends up being very reductionist around healthcare access, for example. Very important healthcare access. People should have access to healthcare. But we all know people who have terrific access to healthcare and are still wildly unhealthy. So one does not immediately equate to the other. So the missing steps in there, I mean, that's happened for lots of different reasons, but I think those are some of the big ones.
At the same time, wellness is on the rise. This is like a very hot thing. Everyone's into wellness. We're seeing things like yoga and mindfulness and meditation penetrating mainstream culture in a way that they never have been before. People thinking about their health in holistic terms. Do you see this as enough? Are we going to be able to get to the point and to the solutions that you explore with these cultures? Or is there, I guess what I'm getting at is there's sort of an elitist sheen around some of these things, and I'm not sure that they're really connecting with everyday folks across the country.
Well, I'd say two things. One is that I am optimistic about where we can go, for sure. And that's a lot of, I think, even with this series. I mean, that is a theme that I really wanted to make sure we got across, because this isn't a pessimistic sort of look at things. This is optimistic because it is possible, because we see what is possible in other places. We know some of these things can be adopted over here in the United States. I think that, I think, when you look at cultures that are very similar to ours and say, okay, maybe they eat the way that we do, they have some of the same issues that we do overall with regard to lifestyle, and yet they have better mortality rates. They have better life expectancy. What are the things that distinguish them, right? And some of it gets at what you're talking about, whether it be the incorporating of these practices of taking control of your mind for periods of time, either through mindfulness or yoga or visualization, whatever it may be. But what is it really that ends up being something that buffers the society against some of these tragic trends that we're seeing in the United States? And interestingly, Rich, I think, and this is going to sound a little squishy around the edges, but I think a lot of it has to do with how we invest in what these places call social cohesion, how we actually think about community. I mean, I think in the United States, this idea of rugged individualism becoming this sort of mantra, rugged individualism was probably never going to be a great strategy for making us live longer, healthier, and happier lives because it's isolating, it's lonely. When you find these cultures that are, again, similar to our culture, but have these points of distinction, it usually involves communities that have been invested in at the community level, at the state level, at the federal level, whatever it might be, seeing the value in that in some way. So I think the things that are taking on the sort of elitist sheen around meditation, I think those are important things. But I guess the analogy in some ways would be that as doctors, you don't want to just treat symptoms, you want to look at the root cause of something. Right. And meditation, whatever it might be, are really helpful at alleviating the suffering, I think, that comes with a society that is decreasing in life expectancy and increasing in mortality. But there is a root cause in here. And I think a lot of it has to do with our own social isolation. And I know that, again, I say that as a evidence-based guy who likes to look at data, but I think that you have plenty of examples now around the world where you see the positive impact of reducing that social isolation.
Right. Should we look at our first clip?
Let's do it.
So I think the first one is Bolivia.
Yeah.
So why Bolivia?
I was, so it was really interesting. First of all, I have a really strong family history of heart disease. My father had heart surgery when he was 47. My grandfather died of a heart attack when he was 50. And so, I think when you live with that, you sort of think it's preordained for you. You think, okay, I'm trying to do all the right things, but I'm hearing different things from different people in terms of what is the right thing, and should I be taking a statin medication? Should I not? What's the best diet? And it becomes all consuming in a way, because when you're thinking about this, it becomes the only thing you can think about. So I read this little blurb about a group of people living in Bolivia that basically had no evidence of heart disease, very little, which was incredible. Just you think, okay, well, are there populations around the world that don't have heart disease? And the answer is really no. I mean, Japanese women for some time were thought to be a population that was relatively insulated from heart disease, but even in Japan now, because of a lot of the influences from Western culture, you see more heart disease there than before. But this little tribe, as it turns out, called the Chimani tribe, that live in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. They're an indigenous tribe, true hunter-gatherer, farmer-forager sort of tribe, seem to have no evidence of heart disease. So I decided I wanted to go see this. In some ways, it was a selfish journey because I really wanted to learn, like, what was it about them? And it was an amazing journey, right? Again, feel very privileged. You fly into La Paz, Bolivia, which is incidentally the highest capital city in the world. Yeah. Did not know it's about 12,500 feet. They give you oxygen when you come off the plane there. It's really interesting. Right. And then you fly. We flew from there down to a little town called Ruranbaque, which is on the edge of the Amazon rainforest in Bolivia. I got in these 4x4 vehicles and drove hours into the forest until we could drive no more, and then got into these dugout canoes and just drifted these streams until we found the Chimani indigenous tribe. And they live in these tribes. It's usually about 120 people, various places, usually along the banks of various rivers or streams. And there's probably thousands that make up the tribe overall, but we found this one encampment, and basically decided to live like a Chamani for a while and see what their lives
Does
were like.
geography isolate them from impinging, urban culture that
Yes.
is encroaching on them?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. They're pretty off the grid, and I think a lot of it is geography. Interestingly, and I didn't know this, but they most of them probably came from Europe, and they actually came to the sort of southern tip of South America and then sort of migrated into the Amazon rainforest. We sort of learned this because they don't speak a language that's remotely similar to any language I had ever heard. It's not at all like Spanish. It's not like any Romance language. And I learned that there's about 6,500 languages in the world, and 94% of the population speaks 6% of the languages. Which means that, you can do the math.
Right.
I can't.
Right.
It's late on a Tuesday for me, but whatever. So
He flew in today. Come on,
Yes.
he got up really early.
just to hang out with the fittest man in the world.
He's a neurosurgeon. He's not a mathematician. All right, why don't we play the clip?
All right, let's take a look.
We're headed to the river for fish and anything else they can catch. It's subsistence living, which I know has its benefits.
Part of the reason they're so healthy is because they have to really exert themselves. They have to be really active, work very hard just to get a meal.
Research shows that Chamani are on the move nearly 90% of their waking hours. If you have a Fitbit, that's an average of 17,000 steps every day. Back home, most of us are lucky if we hit 5,000. And to make up for it, we pay nearly $30 billion on gym and health club memberships and still develop more heart disease than they do.
I mean, it's amazing. We've seen this before, but never so starkly. This idea that wealth does not buy health. In fact, it probably sacrifices it. All right. Let's see my bow and arrow teacher, how he does here. Nothing comes easily out here. That's part of what it's all about.
So those are the Chamani, and it's really interesting. I'll just tell you briefly, because I was really fascinated by the specifics. Their diet is about 70% carbs. I think people think of the paleo diet when they think of hunter-gatherers, and it's not typically a paleo diet. It's 70% carbs, 15% protein, 15% fat. If you're living in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, farming food is like putting money in the bank. That's stuff you can count on. You might have bad hunting days, bad fishing days, but you can count on your farm food. They walk a lot, as I said, but they don't really run. Hunters don't typically outrun their prey. They're going to outlast their prey. So 17,000 steps a day, which seems doable, right? It's not totally wacky. They sleep a lot. I set up this little tent in the middle of the encampment, and sun goes down about 9:30, and I started hearing snoring and deep breathing everywhere. Turns out if you don't have a device to look at, you go to bed pretty early. About 6:30 in the morning, you hear the call and answer of the rooster out in the forest, and they'd wake up. It's about 9 hours of sleep. So those are the big three: diet, activity, and rest. One other thing I'll just mention quickly, and it was fascinating to me, and something to ponder. But almost all of them, and I think this is a big distinguishing thing, almost all of them live with some degree of parasitic infection. Get a parasitic infection, hookworm, roundworm, giardia, young in life, usually a few days of illness. But the reason this was so relevant, Rich, was I think that most of our human existence, we probably cohabitated with parasites. They were in our bodies. And if you think about so many diseases, whether it be heart disease or some of the other diseases you mentioned, they're either ignited or worsened by our own immune system. And the idea that you could have this sort of immune modulator in your body in the form of a parasite that could, help prevent your immune system from actually worsening these diseases, I think is really intriguing. We live in these self-imposed hygienic bubbles in the pursuit of good health, no doubt, but sometimes it might be harming us more than we realize.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting tweak in that, like my Western-trained mind goes to, well, we just need to bottle those parasites and then sell this as a health panacea and eradicate heart disease. And to do that is to miss the bigger picture here, which is that environment dictates health or lack thereof, and these people live in an environment that's very conducive to these activities, this way of life, this way of eating, being, moving, being together, going to sleep when the sun goes down, that ultimately translates into greater health, right? So my takeaway is, how can we build more of those natural rhythms into our own lives?
That's right. I think absolutely. It's totally logical the way that they live. It makes sense. That's how they have to live. And I think, a lot of times when you look at these places, the answer often comes back to, how did we live as humans for most of our existence? We're looking at the blink of an eye of our human existence. What was 99.9% of our existence really like? And I think that's important, because that's how we evolved to be. We have certain receptors in our body that are receptors that are specific toward the environment in which we live. They activate certain things in our bodies. We oftentimes stay away from those things. I mean, look, no one's going to go out and wittingly get a parasitic infection, right? I mean, that's not going to happen. Although if you change the name, you might be onto something with the bottle.
Biohackers who don't want to try that.
Right.
We should move on to the next clip, but I had
Okay.
one final thought on this, which is, I was reading a little bit about this tribe, and one thing that has happened in recent years is the advent of motors on some of these boats and canoes, and also the importing of oils, which have found their way into their diet.
Yeah.
And this is now changing the landscape in terms of their heart disease rates. So it's that idea of the modern industrial world exporting its way of life, and it's ultimately finding its way into these indigenous cultures to remove that one thing that led you to go visit them in the first place.
It's really sad. I mean, because you do find these places that are primarily, really off the grid. Although you notice even the clothing, right? That there's clearly been an influence. There's been these inflection points with modern society. But some of this stuff, whether it be the oils to cook with instead of coconut oil, which they use naturally to cook plantains and make these wonderful foods, these other oils or whatever foods are just, they're too desirable. You just can't not have it once you've been exposed to it. And part of it is the palate, part of it is the mouthfeel, whatever it is. We don't have to have these foods, clearly, but once you've been exposed to it, it's really tough
Hard to go back.
Yeah, to give it back.
That's why you just can't eat one chip.
That's right. That's right.
All right, the next clip is Japan. It involves owls, I hear.
Yeah,
So
this is an
Sanjay,
interesting
talk
clip,
to us
but
about
let me
this.
just tell you an interesting thing about Japan. Japan is and I learned this, is considered the most stressed country in the world. After the World War, they built the miracle economy, right? Out of the dust and destruction of the World War, and no one thought it could be done. This little island nation built the second largest economy in the world, and the growth was explosive. For decades. I lived in Japan for a while, and I saw some of that explosive growth. Just buildings, big buildings going up every few weeks, in Tokyo and other places. And I think that's the expectation was that growth was always going to continue. That was going to continue, and that the generation that built that growth expected their kids to do the same thing. And that was never going to probably be possible to continue that trajectory. And the expectations on the next generation became so significant and so toxic that it has caused a lot of stress, especially among younger people. Japan, a country that hardly talks about mental illness, has a term now, which is widely known, called karoshi. And karoshi means either illness or death from overwork. It's a medically reimbursable term. If someone dies, and the family can be reimbursed because of karoshi illness. The hospitalization is reimbursed. But there's young people who are dying by suicide in just unbelievably tragic ways in Japan, holding hands, standing on top of their skyscrapers and jumping off. And it's a bit of a cautionary tale about the expectations we think about for ourselves, for the next generation, and how toxic a stress that can be on people. The clip you're going to see is very different in some ways, because what happens, I think, naturally, is that people start to come up with ways to try and mitigate that stress, and they try all sorts of different things. You've probably seen rage rooms, for example. That's become quite a thing. They do adult swaddling in Japan. That's become a thing. They also have these cat cafes, and as you're about to see, somebody you like cat cafes?
Yeah.
Is that, okay. And an owl cafe. And just fair warning, I'm not really into birds, but take a look.
All right.
Against my better judgment, I'm gonna try the latest trend.
Those are real owls.
This is one of at least 10 owl cafes in Tokyo, where customers come to unwind by watching, petting, and holding these birds of prey.
I'm not really scared of a lot of things, but the birds creep me out a little bit. These are raptors. These cute little guys will rip your eyes out if they could.
Somehow, they're supposed to melt away your stress.
Like this? Okay. He's tied to me. Great. Gaia. Her name is Gaia? Gaia. Okay. Gaia. Be nice, Gaia. Perhaps the owl is really cute, and therefore it's supposed to relieve your stress. All I see is a bird of prey. And I feel like it's looking at me right now. I'm holding an owl. His name is Gaia. I can feel these sharp talons starting to slowly penetrate my glove. Ah, Jesus Christ. It's not relaxing at all.
I don't get it.
I was not
I guess you have
relaxed
to be
after
really
that.
present.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's got their thing, right? That
The cat
relaxes
thing,
them.
I get. But
But the way a culture evolves to try and come up with these stress relieving techniques, I think is really interesting. Japan is fascinating because on one hand you have the mainland, and then if you go off of the southeast coast, you have a chain of islands, Okinawa, and Okinawa is a blue zone, and they have the highest concentration of centenarians on the planet, people who live to 100 years or more, and so it's a real juxtaposition. And it's also one of the poorest places in Japan. Again, getting at this idea that we often just immediately associate wealth and health. We think we can buy health. And just about everywhere I traveled, almost the inverse was true. We first, I think, recognized that through this famous study called the China study, people may have read, where the expectation was that wealthy Hong Kong businessmen were going to be far healthier than rural Chinese farmers. And when they actually investigated this, they found the opposite was true. And now that maybe sounds obvious, but at the time, it was this belief that we can just buy our way through these problems. And, Japan's another example.
yeah. Intellectually, we understand it. We understand we need to reduce stress. We need to reduce anxiety. We need to live more, close to the land and the natural rhythms of the planet. And we can go and we travel to these places and we see this and we say, I should do this, or this a little bit more. And then we just fall back into the rhythm,
Right.
the gestalt of our daily lives.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why can't we translate these ancient practices that human beings have been doing forever and build them into our routine?
Well, I think there's a couple things when you talk about the United States specifically. I think, and I want to be as eloquent as I can on this. I think there is a provincial sort of feeling in the United States that if something is not made in America, it has little, if any, value, right? It's got to be made here, it's got to be created here, and oftentimes practices that are from other parts of the world are seen as practices over there, somewhere else, not here. And I think that's a problem because obviously, just as a general concept, clearly there are places around the world where they're spending less, they're having happier, healthier lives, all the things that we talked about. I think the other thing is and I know there's a lot of physicians in the room tonight, is I think what is the barrier by which we would consider something evidence-based, right? And it's really important, to make sure that you have evidence, and you want to make sure that things certainly aren't harmful to people. But some of these things are not going to get studied, right? You're not going to have the blinded randomized trial to prove that something like owl therapy or whatever it might be works, right? You're just never going to have that.
It definitely worked with you, though.
Right, yeah. So what should be the requirement in terms of what we will accept as some reasonable evidence or proof or value of something, knowing full well that we may not be able to get the double-blinded trial. I was talking to Steve Mosca earlier, I don't know if he's still here, and he was telling me about this. Steve, are you still here? He's still here. He's talking about this turpentine cleanse that he does. I can say this now because he's not here. And I was like, turpentine cleanse. I'm like, what is that, right? And I have no way of knowing. And he's like, what do you think? I'm like, doesn't sound good to me, But he's somebody who's tried this thing, and he said, well, what's the data on this? And I said, well, I doubt there is any data on this. Who's going to study that? Hey, would you knowingly give 5,000 people a turpentine cleanse, 5,000 people not, make sure they're totally controlled, similar populations of people, and figure out if it works for whatever it's supposed to do or not? My point is that to demand a level of evidence that may not be achievable in the first place may not be the best way to some of these things. And I think that's part of why we don't incorporate some of these things into our own lives.
Sure. But stress and anxiety are real problems. There's lots of studies on the downstream impact of these things in a chronic state in our lives. Tokyo is, I'm sure, the most extreme example of what happens when you have so many people living in a compacted area who are living very high stress lives and working long hours. And the future bodes that our cities are moving more and more towards that. Short of owl therapy, like what have you learned? And you did another documentary on this very subject. Like what have you learned about the nature of stress, our anxiety response to it, and how we can mitigate it or think about it or shift our habits to put ourselves in a better position to not experience it.
Well, one thing, and we did this documentary for HBO. It came out a couple weeks ago called "One Nation Under Stress," and it was looking at this very issue. I mean, let me preface by saying something again that I think is really important, and that is that the United States is unique in so many ways. But if you look at labor forces, you look at economy challenges, recessions, things that have. There are countries around the world that share some of these same pressures that we have had in the United States, right? So you can't lay the story about what is happening with stress and what is causing this anxiety squarely in any particular camp, like the economy, like the labor force. Instead, you start to look at, if we are similar, what are those things that seem to be buffering us? And this gets back a little bit to this notion of how much the social cohesion seems to be a benefit. And part of that gets back to just how we humans were supposed to live. We are social creatures, and if you do things to break down those barriers towards this rugged individualism, it tends to be really beneficial. So I think that makes a big difference. We also, stress is often thought of as a bad thing. And I don't think of stress as a bad thing. I mean, we need stress in our lives. I mean, we need stress to survive and thrive. Yeah. There's this great book that I read. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the whole point was that if you're a zebra and you're being chased, you need the stress to survive. And then when you're not being chased, your stress levels come way back down again. So I think that's the other thing that we sort of have to think about it a little bit differently. It's not to just totally, people say, I just want to get rid of stress in my life. That's probably not going to happen, and it's not a good or worthwhile thing to try and attain. So it's more a question of how do we get rid of the constant nature of stress? Mm-hmm. How do we have these periods of time in our day when we can actually start to rebound a bit from the stress? And some of that is again, some of the techniques that we've talked about. Some of it is just this idea that unpredictability as a human ends up being one of the biggest stressors. So if you can achieve periods of time within your day where you have predictability, where you feel like you have control, for you, it's exercise.
Well, I'm a control freak. So
I know you're a control freak, yes.
This is like music to my ears.
Right, and my guess is you have periods of stress, but you're not overall a very stressed guy.
I don't know.
Yeah, so
A little bit.
you're pretty cool, you just. Yeah. But I think it's more finding the natural ebbs and flows. I worry about the next generation. I worry about my own kids. I have 3 girls, 13, 12, and 10. They're lovely. I love them. But the impact of social media and the constant nature of being connected that way, besides the fact that people can say mean things and it's weird to me and that whole thing. But the idea that you can never disconnect is a problem, because I think it leads to that constant nature of things.
Yeah.
We're not ever going to be constantly low, but I think how do we get to the natural rhythm that we humans are supposed to have?
Yeah. And this juxtaposition of having Okinawa just offshore and a very different lifestyle, a lifestyle more similar to the Bolivian culture.
That's right.
A diet very similar to the Bolivian culture,
Right.
for the most part. And whereas you have this karoshi idea in Japan, you also have in Okinawa this idea of ikigai, which is kind of their North Star and how they live their life, oriented around being purposeful, finding meaning and purpose.
Ikigai is if you ask people in Okinawa, why do you think you live so long? Like Ikigai is definitely a word that'll come up, and it's their sense of purpose in life. And besides the fact that it's just a good thing to know what your sense of purpose is, and to recognize it on a daily basis, to think about what your sense of purpose is today, it's also something that grows with age, which I thought was really interesting. Like I think in the States and a lot of other developed countries, you get to the mid-60s and you are retiring, and so you may, in a sense, feel discarded from your professional life. If you don't have, again, close family ties or friend ties, you may feel discarded from your personal life as well, and your sense of purpose starts to diminish. In Japan and many other countries, Asian countries in particular, ikigai tends to grow, so you're more revered. People live in multi-generational homes, whatever it might be. My wife thinks it's a terrible idea, by the way. She doesn't want my parents living with us at all. But
That's a whole other
That's a whole other thing. That's a stressful, it's really stressful thing.
Stress is good, though.
Stress can be good, but not the stress.
Just out of curiosity here, raise your hand if within the last year somebody asked you point blank, what is your purpose? There's a couple. Actually, that's more people than I would have thought. Because I'm just thinking, what would our culture look like if from a very young age, periodically, our teachers, our family members would nudge us and say, what's your purpose?
Yeah.
Have you thought about your purpose? How's that purpose coming along?
Yeah.
How that would affect how we think about our role in society.
That's beautiful, Rich. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we're living at such a brisk pace sometimes that just being able to take a moment and ask that question and be thoughtful about it for ourselves, for the ones that we love, I think can make a huge difference. Right. It's a constant sort of reset button on things, and probably a good reminder, because we know what our purpose is. Everyone knows. Sometimes it's so clouded and so buried underneath all the other stuff that we're exposed to that it may be hard to pull out and extract, but it's there. And I think if you know it, you totally live your life differently. And I think that's very much what we see in Okinawa.
Yeah. Until then, owls.
Until then, owls, right.
All right, the next clip is you traveling to Norway.
Norway.
Let's talk about Norway.
Norway's the happiest country in the world. Now, it's interesting because I went to a city that's 270 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's plunged into darkness, total darkness, a few months out of the year, and a lot of darkness many months out of the year. And you think to yourself, why would a place like that be happy? Why would they be the happiest? It was really interesting, and I think some of this, nothing applies to everyone. Everyone has their own sort of barometer and how they look at the world and how they approach things. But I think what we really learned from Norway, in part, was this idea that overcoming some sort of challenge on a regular basis provides the greatest opportunity for incredible happiness, right? You want to have the incredible happiness. You may have periods where you're clearly not as happy. You may even be sad. But would you rather have periods of your life where you have incredible joy, just the most joy that you can possibly imagine? Or would you rather have a life where you're sort of somewhat happy, but it's always kind of more here? Living in a beautiful place, a beach that never changes, gives you happiness, but it's not something that gives you incredible joy ever. What would you pick? And for everyone, the answer is going to be different. But in Norway, their self-reported happiness is the highest in the world, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's not despite their environment. Mm-hmm. It's in some ways because of their environment that they're that happy. And I just wanted to go spend time there and understand that life. I spent time with all sorts of people. We were there for quite a while. But there was a woman in particular who I met early on who had suffered from significant depression, had gone through the ladder of different therapies, antidepressants, various types of therapies for her depression, and eventually came to this part of Norway that we were to try and be a part of that environment and see if it might help her.
All right. Cue the clip.
That first hike, it felt amazing. I can actually do it. My body can actually do more than I think that it can do. It was a really great feeling, really. Like I'm on top of the world kind of feeling.
So, Marianne, what are you thinking right now when you look at this?
I think peace of mind. It's just spectacular.
You've gone through a lot in your life, and you've tried lots of different things to heal yourself. How did this place help heal you?
I feel humble. It's little me against nature. But at the same time, I feel like I can achieve something.
I could see why you would never get used to this.
No.
And you shouldn't get used to this. Some things in life and nature should always feel awesome.
Yeah.
It's
Beautiful.
it's a really beautiful place,
Yeah.
and it was cold. It was again, the environment was challenging, and yet you felt as Marianne said, you felt humble, and you felt and somehow that feeling it was incredibly joyful. I mean, I felt it as well, just being there, not living there, but feeling it for that period of time. It was.
It's interesting that when you asked her how she felt, the first thing that she said was humble.
Yeah.
So it makes me think about the relationship of humility in this happiness equation. And here in the States, we're all pursuing happiness. We're like chasing this thing, as opposed to just accessing the happiness that's already within us.
Right.
I'm curious about the grandeur of nature and the impact on that sense of humility and how that plays into how we feel about ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, clearly for her, it was a clear relationship. We talked more about it, and she also, there's a vulnerability that she felt being outside, and I think the idea of being okay, being vulnerable, and being able to share that was something that she was never able to do before, and she found it incredibly liberating to just be able to recognize that there was things that were clearly larger than herself, and made her feel humble but also vulnerable. And after a while, at first that can be really frightening, but eventually was in a way very liberating. I think was part of the reason that she was able to feel that sense of happiness. And again, someone who really hadn't had it for years was able to get it in nature. There was something else too, which you and I've talked a little bit about, but it's this idea, like when you're outside in nature and you're outside in a beautiful place, it feels good, right? I mean, there's no question about it. It's beautiful. It feels good. But there's something else too that, from a physiological standpoint, that I thought was really interesting, and that is that what we call the aroma of the forest. If you go into the forest and people talk about forest bathing and things like that, when you breathe in the aroma of the forest, what you're also breathing in, besides that smell, are these chemicals known as phytoncides. And trees, various organisms, they have these phytoncides that protect them against toxic stress. That's what these organisms use to protect themselves, and they actually release these phytoncides into the environment as well. And we can breathe these phytoncides into our body, and we have receptors for these phytoncides. Again, getting back to this notion of how we evolved as human beings in our environment, having these receptors probably meant that we were spending a lot more time outside breathing these things in, and we are getting maybe the benefit of that toxic stress buffering
amazing.
as well. So there's a scientific underpinning, which I thought was really interesting. Besides the fact that it just feels good, there's probably a real reason that it feels good.
Right. The Norwegians also have their own word, which I'm not going to be able to pronounce. It's something like friluftsliv, which translates into free air life.
Right. That's pretty
Did
good.
you come across this word in doing this? Because this is that clip really, to me, like embodies that sensibility. They have a lifestyle there that, they work 5 days a week for 7 hours. They get 5 weeks of vacation, and it's about being outdoors and embracing, what we just saw.
Yeah, I did come across the word, by the way. I could not pronounce it, so we took
I
it
don't
out
know.
of the script.
I'm sure I butchered it, but
No, and to be fair, I think that's a really good point. When you talk about Norway, you're talking about a very wealthy country as well, and I don't want to minimize these other aspects. They're one of the largest oil exporters in the world. They have universal health care. They have universal education. It's a wonderful place to live. It has a huge safety net in terms of social fabric and all that, and that I'm sure is part of why they're so happy as well. But there's these other factors, again, which we really wanted to zero in on because we think that they're distinctive, and we think that there are things that we can learn from and maybe adopt into our own lives here.
Do they have community principles around how they live that differ from how we live?
Yeah, no, it's very communal. So, for example, there's universal health care insurance, but this is just a specific example. But if you live in a neighborhood, typically the arbiter of your health care insurance may be somebody that lives in your own neighborhood. It's not a nameless, faceless person at some big organization in a different city. It's someone who you probably know their kids, they know your kids. So when you're worried about healthcare, like I read a statistic yesterday in the United States, 40% of people who have chronic illness are more worried about the bills than the disease itself that they're suffering from. I mean, if you know the person who's actually the arbiter of your healthcare, your healthcare insurance and how that's all going to be paid, it's a much more sort of collegial relationship, and it takes a lot of that emotional burden off. So that's just an example, but there's all sorts of investments in building social fabric in most of the Scandinavian countries, but in particular Norway.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, should we go to the next clip?
The next one.
What do we got? India.
India.
Yes.
Mm.
This one's good.
Yeah, a sip of water for India.
Yeah.
I'm Indian, and so who knew? Everyone knew you were the fittest man in the world, but they didn't know I was Indian. Yeah, I love India. I've gone back many times. I used to go a lot as a kid, and then I take my own family there. And it was interesting when I was growing up. My parents are not doctors; they're engineers, and my dad's a mathematician, and so they're very focused on numbers and science and all that. But my mom would always have these home remedies. Still, it was kind of like in my big fat Greek wedding with the Windex. That was kind of like my mom with all these various things, and it was funny because for such a sort of scientifically oriented woman, it was funny how she would really push some of these things and just rub a little mustard oil on that or whatever it might be. And so I wanted to go see some of this, see where some of this came from, and going back to what we were saying earlier, some of this stuff that we learned in India, and in particular Kerala, which is a part of India which is along the southwest coast and almost its own country within India, are not things that you're necessarily going to find a lot of evidence behind, but they are things that have been preserved in the culture, whether they are practices, whether they are a way of eating, a way of living, whatever they may be, for hundreds, sometimes 1,000 years, some of these practices. So as you look at some of this stuff, you do wonder, while I don't have that gold standard evidence again, how much merit, how much weight do I give to something that has just been preserved for that long, that's been handed down generation to generation and has withstood the test of time? One of the things that they practice in Kerala is something known as kalari. It's a way of fighting, it's a way of interacting with people, it's a type of martial art, but it's also a type of very intense massage, as I learned. Take a look.
This is normally what happens here?
Yeah.
The mat on the ground.
The healing system of Kalari is based on energy points in the body called marmas, where bone, muscle, and ligament intersect.
You can tell this is going to be like a surgical procedure. Very hygienic. very sterile.
Kalari masters have a precise knowledge of the body's marmas. In combat, they know which ones to target to strike a fatal blow. But they can use the same knowledge to stimulate the marmas for healing.
Now he's going to apply oil on your body.
Just wondering how heavy this guy is.
This technique is called Chavuti Thirumal, which means foot pressure.
I guess it's no surprise if you want more force, stand on the guy instead of push. Probably is waking up a lot of muscles and ligaments that I didn't know needed waking.
Stimulating marmas is also used to treat more serious illnesses like chronic pain and neuromuscular disease.
You know, I've always wondered about these types of therapies. They've been around for so long, and there's got to be something to it. Why does something last for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years?
Oh. He just stuck his finger to my intestines.
How do you feel now?
Feel a little beat up, a little violated maybe. I feel like I'm a big pile of jello right now.
It's like a CIA black site.
Right.
How long did that go on for?
It went on a long time, much longer
How
than
did you feel?
I thought we had the shot, we were done.
Yeah.
So like, no, we got to keep rolling.
How did you feel after that?
I think you have to get used to some of these things, you know.
It's like
So you go from 0 to 100
equivocating
miles an hour.
Yeah.
But there are people who do this, weekly. In fact, Prime Minister Modi, he does this on a weekly basis. And I had a chance to spend some time with him, interview him about how, as Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy, you're going to provide health care. And how do you think about health care for over 1 billion people in your country? It's really interesting. And, it's a note that we keep hitting tonight, but it's this idea that are there practices that could provide benefit? Yoga is something that is widely practiced. There's an International Yoga Day now, which Prime Minister Modi started, but it's widely practiced in all schools in India as a way of sort of creating a frictionless environment between health and just their way of living. But he does the Kalari massage on a regular basis,
Right.
and believes it really helps him. We showed that little graphic of the marmas, and there's also something the dosos, which are basically a certain balance that we all have a certain amount of dosos in our life, in our body, and creating a balance of dosos is in part how people in Kerala think about achieving health. And again, it's not like I am sick, therefore I need to get healthy. It's just here's how I live my life by constantly keeping my dosos in balance.
Right. Yeah, the doshas being, there's 3 different ones.
That's right.
I think. Kapha, Pitta,
And
Vata.
And Vata, which you are. Yes, you're definitely Vata.
This is part of Ayurvedic medicine,
That's
which
right.
I think was the first canonized system of healing ever, right? Dates back thousands and thousands of years, but primarily it's about prevention. It's about balancing the body's systems so that the body is in a position to heal itself and function optimally,
Yeah.
which is a very different way of looking at health than we look at it, which is to diagnose and prescribe as a disease model.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Ayurvedic diet, for example, is a perfect example, I think, of what you're talking about, Rich. Like, if you think about how a culture, a society creates a diet, like, how do we create our diet? Like, what we're going to eat at certain times. In most places, it is based on palate and mouthfeel, like how foods feel in our mouth and how they taste. The Ayurvedic diet is really based on the functionality of food. What is the function of this food? What dosha does it restore in someone who needs a certain type of dosha restoring? So think about the function of the food first, and then think about making it palatable and all that second. It's delicious food. I mean, I think most people love it for the taste, but that's not what drove the diet in the first place. So if the goal is, as I think what the Ayurvedic diet is, we want to identify the right person who's going to get the right food at the right time, then there is a right diet for that person. But that's just often not how we think about food in again, most places in the world, not just the United States. But if the goal is every time we're going to eat, like what is the function of this food? How is it restoring balance in my body? How is it providing some sort of unmet need or addressing an unmet need in my body? It's a totally different way of looking at food. And I think that's the Ayurvedic diet is a big part of that for them.
Yeah. And the lifestyle even beyond the diet. It's very much about stress reduction.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that sort of revolves around that. And again, it's not something that is like, I will now, sit or lie for 23 hours out of the day and then go to the gym for an hour, right? It is about incorporating this into their daily life in all sorts of different ways. So it's has the highest literacy rate in all of India. It has the lowest rate of chronic disease in all of India. And, just from a happiness standpoint, from a joy standpoint, it's certainly one of the happier places there as well.
So I'm envisioning, maybe I'm projecting, but I'm envisioning this internal turmoil and conflict within you, because on the one hand, you have this Indian heritage and you're an open-minded guy and you've been exposed to some of these practices since you were young, but you're also a very pragmatic, grounded person with a Western medicine education, neuroscience, all of these things. Like, how do you square these two worlds and parse what's apocryphal from fact and truth?
Yeah, I think it is the question, and it is the sort of tension. I think the entire time we were thinking about this and filming it and everything. I mean, I think there's some basic truisms, right? I mean, certainly when we're talking about some of these types of therapies, people should not be getting exploited. They should not be dangerous in some way. People should not forego known therapies that can work, that can actually that have real data behind them. But beyond that, the idea that there might be other types of therapies that could provide a benefit that are less toxic, less expensive, more easily incorporated into your life, I think those are the types of things that we really wanted to try and find. It's interesting, I don't know if Gary Small's still here. Dr. Small, you still here? Over here. Well, we were just talking earlier, I mean, for years my mom's been talking about turmeric, right? I mean, we eat turmeric with our diet every day. If you're an Indian family, your counters are literally stained yellow because of turmeric, which is put into everything, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My mom would always say, just like with the Windex, this stuff is the magic stuff. And now, in part due to Dr. Small's work and some other work that's going on, we know the power of turmeric. Its antioxidant properties, its anti-inflammatory properties. They started to notice in certain places in South Asia that rates of certain types of dementia were lower than other parts of the world, and they started to look to the environment to say, well, what is the explanation for this? Why would some of these diseases be at lower rates than other parts of the world? And, start to zero in on things that we think could make a difference. Point is that here we're starting to have really good data behind it. But if we look and pay attention to some of these places around the world and look for what might be distinctive about them, some really interesting answers start to emerge. And so the tension's there. My mom loves being told that she was actually right on these things. Yeah. So that's a lot of tension too. But it's a fun journey for me to be able to straddle, I think, both those worlds.
Yeah. And I think there's a distinction between acute medical conditions and just being in a preventative state of mind or being in terms of how we think about our health.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's sad that I think there's, a significant distrust that has grown of the mainstream medical system in this country. Some of it has to do, I think, with the terrible headlines that you get about pharmaceutical costs and guys like Martin Shkreli and lack of access for tens of millions of people. Those are just terrible things, and you can see how that creates this feeling of mistrust. But it also makes it seem like healthcare is a necessary evil, as opposed to something that can actually make you feel better, be better, just bring you more happiness and health, not just something that diagnoses or treats disease.
Right.
that's not how we think about healthcare in this country. But in many of the countries that we visited, it's exactly how they think about healthcare. You know, it's a place where you're not going just when you're sick, but you're thinking about health in terms of optimizing how you live on a regular basis.
Right. Well, I think it's systemic, yes. I mean, most doctors are in a situation where they have a very finite period of time to see a patient, 15 minutes or whatever it is. It's just not adequate to really do these kinds of alternative, explorations into what's making people well. And yet at the same time, we're seeing the growth, the rise of functional medicine clinics and doctors and preventative health methodologies finding their way to work within the Western system in a synergistic way. So how do you think about that, and how can we move our system into into this preventive mindset?
Look, I think 70 to 80% of chronic disease in this country is totally preventable. I mean, I'm practicing medicine at a time where I think most of the disease I care for is manufactured. You know, it's unbelievable to think of it that way. I'm basically taking care of problems that are being created upstream. That is probably no way to live. You know, I mean, functional medicine clinics and all that are great, but they come about because of the fact that we are needing to be taught how to prevent 70 to 80% of the disease that we're suffering with. Now, it's not to say that there's not, there's trauma and there's other diseases that people develop that are not preventable. And, we certainly need a medical system to be able to take care of that. But if I was going to have the greatest impact, any of us, or as a society, if we're going to have the greatest impact, it would probably not be in learning how to better take care of heart disease. We actually have done a pretty good job in terms of learning how to take care of heart disease after someone's already developed it. But the greatest impact, exponentially greater impact would be in terms of actually not manufacturing the diseases that are leading people to develop these problems in the first place. And in that regard, I do worry a bit. Again, I'm optimistic overall, but I think we are now living at a time where because of food policy, and also I think in part what we're now seeing with energy policy and deregulation of some of our energy policies. We, had Earth Day, I think first April of 1970, I believe, because of what was happening in the United States at that point. Rivers catching on fire, terrible smog in places like Los Angeles, real concerns about our air and our water, and we have made some of the greatest strides of any other country on earth in terms of cleaning that up. And now we're starting to see some concerning policies that might take us backwards, but more to my point, creating more of these illnesses, these totally preventable illnesses again. So, it's a really staggering statistic to think about the fact that, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic at all, 70% or so of chronic disease in this country is totally preventable.
Yeah. The last place that you visited, I think oh no, we didn't go to Italy yet. Let's talk about Italy.
Italy, yes.
Yeah.
Italy.
Everybody's favorite country.
Italy's the healthiest country in the world. It is. It's according to the World Health Organization. And it's interesting because, you think Italy, you're like, wow, they smoke, they drink, they eat fatty foods. They're not really known for exercise, and yet they're the healthiest country in the world. And again, this gets back, I think, we love these measurables. I will lower my blood pressure. I will lower my cholesterol. I will do X, Y, and Z, because that's the evidence-based stuff that we look at and we can measure. But yet you find these places around the world where people live lives that don't necessarily abide by those principles, and yet they still have great longevity, and they live longer lives, healthier lives than we do. There's even communities within the United States. There's a community in Pennsylvania called Roseto, and Roseto, Pennsylvania it's kind of amazing community, primarily of Italian immigrants, where, again, they lived the life of their home country, where they ate some of the same foods, drank, they ate a lot of foods that we wouldn't necessarily consider the healthiest, but they had some of the lowest rates of heart disease anywhere in the country. And, those are places worth taking a look at. There's all sorts of things that we explored in the show on Italy. We spent time in Sardinia, which is another blue zone. We spent a lot of time talking about wine, so I learned a lot about wine. We talked a lot about belief and faith. It's a country that has some of the highest percentage of people who identify as having faith of any country in the world. But there's also something else that's been going on in Italy, and that is some of the governmental policies over there have led to a real tough economy. You had over 40% unemployment after 2008 recession, primarily among young people. And as a result, people have had to start to look for different ways to be able to live, to be able to fuel and feed themselves. And one of the things that we saw was something called cucina povera. So take a look.
Salvatore Denaro hasn't had a steady job in years, but he's found a distinctly Italian way to help put food on the table. He's a forager who finds his food in pretty much the last place I'd ever look.
Salvatore, we're in the middle of a neighborhood here.
Sì, e questo è il mio segreto, di andare a scovare anche vicino a una piccola città la possibilità di avere delle erbe.
Right outside your door.
This type of foraging is an Italian tradition, cucina povera, which literally means poor kitchen, and it stems from a deep connection to the land, and when money's tight, making the most of what the land has to offer.
Le persone che vivono in città devono andare nei supermercati e spendere molti soldi per nutrirsi.
So for you, it's much more affordable to eat this way.
This is economic for me. La natura è ricca di tante erbe buone da mangiare per la nostra salute. Oh, Sanjay, guarda. It's borage. See? The big leaves, this is good for the soup.
You're making me hungry.
Naturale, eh? Molto bello.
Smells so fresh.
Sì, molto fresh. Bellissima.
It tastes like cucumbers.
Sì, sempre cucumbers. Possiamo? Come on. Come on. Oh, this is the Swiss chard wild. Spontaneous.
Swiss chard.
Swiss chard, sì.
Put it in the basket. It's eating food off the ground. I love it.
It's good for my life. Preferisco guardare sempre per terra e non nel cielo. Io so che sotto i miei piedi c'è qualcosa che posso mangiare.
I don't think I'm going to be able to walk through an area like this ever the same again. I'm going to always look
Sì.
to see what's underneath my feet.
So let me get this straight. You just walked through a field and took stuff out of the ground and
Yeah.
ate it?
Yeah, imagine
What a
that, right?
radical idea.
Right.
What I love about it is you're like right off a main road in
Yeah.
like a neighborhood. You're not like, you didn't bivouac, miles
No.
into nature to do this.
No, I mean, it's kind of amazing. And, some of this is born out of necessity, right? I mean, because of what has been happening in Italy over the last 10, 12 years with the economy. You see a lot of people who are foraging. People talk about urban gardens and things like that in the United States. Very planned, in some ways, very helpful to be able to get some of these types of fruits and vegetables to places that don't often have access. But I think what we were seeing in Italy, and this was all over the place, was this sort of neighborhood foraging, which is going on. And it's kind of incredible when you start to learn about it and see what you can actually eat from the ground, just even in a
Right.
neighborhood like that. It's remarkable.
And when you really think about it, what's strange is that we think it's strange because this is
Right.
part and parcel of who we are as human beings. We did this as hunter-gatherers for 90,000 years.
I know.
It's only in the last 5 minutes that we stopped doing
Yes,
this.
it's the blink of an eye. It's funny you say that because in some ways, when we were even writing some of the stuff for this, I thought to myself at times, this is so obvious. Some of this is so obvious. Are people going to find this interesting at all? Because it seems so obvious.
Yeah.
And yet it is interesting because all we know is these last 5 minutes of our human existence. We just need a little reminding of how we lived most of our time as humans on this earth. And I think that's, in part, again, born out of necessity in Italy, but taking us back to our roots, quite literally.
Yeah, and so to kind of canonize all of this, you have faith, you have, these are like blue zone principles, right? Community, like living with your elders, living as a village, living within the, in accordance with the rhythms of nature, being outdoors, getting your food directly from the land, fishing in the rivers that are running through your backyard, and an environment that is conducive to this kind of movement, like sort of just gradual, like not overly exerted movement, but just constant kind of motion throughout the day.
Yeah,
Right.
I think so. I mean, if you look at some of the things that tie these blue zones together, it is all those things. And I think what's interesting is sometimes we extrapolate from what we know of these places and say, I want to take that thing and box it into 35 minutes of my day. And as you're saying, I think, Rich, that's you have to consider not only what it is, but the environment in which it's being done. Those two things have to go hand in hand,
Right, because whether it's happiness or super healthy hearts or just feeling connected or having ikigai and purpose, these aren't things that any of these people are chasing or searching for. They're just a byproduct of the way that they're living.
That's right. And I know I've mentioned this social cohesion thing again a lot tonight, but in Japan, one of the other words besides ikigai is moai, M-O-A-I, and it's kind of like your tribe, right? It's your group, it's your friends, it's your family, it's people that you spend time with, that you're willing to be vulnerable around, share with, who are willing to check in on you if you're not doing well, or if they know you well enough to know when you've had a downturn, or whatever it may be, whatever it is. But the concept of moai, the concept of having that social, fabric, that connection, seems to be one of the big buffers. I'll tell you myself personally, I'm not a particularly social person. I've just never been a very social person. Just not. But I've done a better job of that since I started shooting this series, because I've seen that be so important. Not just in terms of your social life, like your happiness and things like that, but in terms of your physical and your mental health as well. I saw that in so many places that it's something that I've started to be better about myself.
Well, the way that we define success is so evidently backwards in so many ways once we kind of look at these things. Like, we make a lot of money and then we ensconce ourselves in a large house and we put a fence around it and we do all of these things that isolate ourselves, and then we start eating all these crazy foods that aren't healthy for, like all of these practices that are counter to all the things that we're actually searching for.
No doubt, and I think that we can recognize in other people when that way of life has become toxic for them. We can see that. If someone drops of a cardiac arrest right now, you probably have some idea of what to do. Go start pushing on the chest, pump blood through the body. If someone is having an arrest of mental health, we don't know what to do. We turn the other way, So not only is there an increasing incidence of this because of these siloed off lives that we're leading and the increased loneliness that accompanies that, we don't even really check in on each other or engage in some way when we see somebody going into crisis either. And I think it's a problem. And I'm not in any way, trying to place blame. I'm just saying, if you look at other countries around the world, they live their lives very differently in that regard. We can measure all the things that we measure. We can look at the incidence of heart disease and cancer rates and autoimmune disease, which has increased dramatically in the developed world, especially among women. We can look at all those things in aggregate and point to them and put numbers on them. But in terms of what it is that ultimately is a more unifying destructive force that can be addressed and fixed, I think it really comes back to this notion that we are fundamentally social creatures. You put us into isolation, no matter how healthy you treat us in isolation, and you can live around a lot of people and be isolated. But if the feeling of isolation is there, that ends up being an incredibly toxic thing. And if the feeling of isolation isn't there, it can be incredibly protective and buffering against many of the things that we worry about.
Right. Yeah, we have this impulse and this tradition of being reductive in how we look at all these things.
That's right.
And the solution ultimately is in a more holistic approach to.
I think so, and you can start to define that. You can really start to put some edges around that and define what that means for you, for us as a society, for the people that you love. What that really means to live that sort of life starts to take real shape and real form.
Right. Turkey. How are we doing on time?
Go to questions.
We got to go to questions.
Yeah.
All right. So let's open it up to questions.
Just a quick reminder, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Questions are typically short. We do not believe in two-part questions.
We do not.
And only Rich gets to ask follow-up questions.
Thank you. I wondered if you looked at the impact on gender and what you studied, particularly concerned with maternal mortality rates being on the rise in the United States and what you saw around the world in other countries similar to us and where maternal mortality rates are dropping.
Yeah. Really important question, and I'm going to tell you that we thought about that. We did not look at that for this series. It was something that came up a lot initially, but we didn't think we could tackle it with all the other things that we were trying to tackle this particular go around. So we're hoping we do more episodes. I don't want to give you a short answer, but just if we had, I'd give you a longer answer, but we hadn't. So.
If you could make 2 suggestions to improve the Affordable Care Act, what would they be?
I thought you just said short questions here. Look,
Are you announcing your candidacy?
No, not definitely not. It's very hard for me to get beyond the fact that I think healthcare insurance and access is important. I think that the fact that we spend $3.5 trillion on healthcare in this country, and that number is expected to just continue to grow. So over the next 10 years, it'll probably be well over $40 trillion. I think is a very addressable issue, but I think it has less to do with policy than it has to do with some of the things that we've been talking about tonight. I mean, if so much of the disease that we're talking about, so much of that cost is 70 to 80% of it's preventable, then I think that's the area that we should really spend time focusing on as well. It's no small issue to think about our energy policy differently in terms of how it relates to human health. I mean, that's a really important issue. It's no small issue to talk about our food policy and how we actually fuel people and fuel young people and create lifelong diets. I think ultimately, if we're trying if the goal is to make a healthier America, then I think policies are around the Affordable Care Act are really important to make sure that people have access to care when they need it. But trying to reduce the amount of care that they need in the first place, I think, is a much more laudable and important goal.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. What's your opinion? Have you come to any conclusions about alcohol and if a little bit is okay, like red wine or not, from your travels?
Those people always ask me those questions, usually because they want some sort of condoning of it. Here's what I'd say on alcohol, and there was a recent study that came out that basically said no amount of alcohol was good. And I think what I would take away from that is that there's long been this belief that red wine, for example, could be good for heart health, and there's all sorts of different mechanisms that people have talked about in terms of reducing blood clot formation, reducing inflammation, whatever it might be. I wouldn't start drinking alcohol for the purposes of trying to achieve health. I think that's how I would frame it.
And our last question.
So I'm Hispanic, and I have this thing about my culture, and you mentioned a lot about going to these places that have to do with food, and our cultural food intake isn't the healthiest, but how do I speak out to, some of my elders that have heart disease and high blood pressure and cholesterol and diabetes to circumnavigate our diet to be better, but not impede on my culture? Like you've gone to a lot of places, and how does that work out?
Well, a lot of the foods that you can eat the foods themselves are not always necessarily the problem as much as how they've been processed or refined and things like that. So, one thing I'll say about, and you may well know, if you look at the 3 largest demographics in the United States, whites, blacks, Hispanics, blacks have the highest mortality rates, but they've been dropping. Hispanics actually have the lowest mortality rates in the country. It's called the Hispanic paradox, and they've continued to drop. As it turns out, it's only whites and primarily working class whites in the United States that's driving up the mortality rates for the country as a whole. So the Hispanic paradox is really interesting. In part, they think, well, the food is so detrimental. Is it related to heart disease? And yet you still have lower mortality rates than the other large demographics in this country. And I think part of that, again, is around the other aspects of the culture that appear to be very beneficial and protective. Some of it, the social part of it, again, whatever it may be. But it's really worth looking at and learning a little bit from that. But I think, it's you go to Europe, you go to Italy, you eat some of the same exact foods as you eat in the United States, and yet they are healthier. It's in part because not so much the food itself, but of its preparation, its refining, its processing. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Rich. Thank you, Dr. Sanjay.